pleasure to welcome you to the 22nd seminar in Phase 4 of our International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the GlobalSouth Network. I am the founder and the chief convener of the GlobalSouth Network and the chief organizer of this International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress weekly seminar series. I'm joined today by two discussants and one peer commentator. The first discussant for today's session is Dr. Rumi Kato Price, who is a professor emeritus at the Washington University St. Louis School of Medicine and the founder of Human Trafficking Research Collaborative Network. Her research interests encompass a range of psychiatric, substance abuse, and trauma epidemiology and prevention topics. Most recently, she has been examining methodologic and epidemiologic information on human trafficking with a focus on global and domestic tracking and identification and prevention intervention strategies for victims and survivors, especially in the areas of post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and other behavioral and environmental risk factors. Previously, she examined trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, suicidality of US military personnel and veterans over 15 plus years. I'm also joined by our second discussant for today's session is Dr. Klea Ramaj, who is a senior research associate based at the Policy Evaluation and Research Unit, Manchester Metropolitan University. Her research interests lie in the fields of family studies, human rights, social policy, and human trafficking. Klea holds a PhD in criminology and MPhil in criminological research from the University of Cambridge. She is also a fellow of the Higher Education Academy UK and holds a PGC LTHE qualification, teaching qualification. Peer commentator for today's session is Giulia Repetti, who is a PhD candidate in social justice at the Leverhulme Doctoral Scholarship Center for Water Cultures at the University of Hull. Her research focuses on the intersections of climate-induced water stress, migration, anti-trafficking frameworks, and labor exploitation, examining how environmental crises shape global mobility and vulnerabilities. Alongside her academic work, she has supported migrant and asylum-seeking communities in Italy and the UK through frontline resettlement integration and anti-trafficking initiatives. Last but not least, our today's guest speaker is Sibanda, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Law at the Open University. His PhD interest utilizes a critical legal approach, particularly at a Marxist lens, to explore the root causes of human trafficking and reconceptualize the meaning of exploitation. Lewis holds LLB degree from the University of South Africa and an LLM degree completed as a Mandela Scholar at the University of Sussex. He is a registered legal practitioner in Zimbabwean superior courts and has worked as a professional research assistant to the Chief Justice of Zimbabwe and another judge of the Constitutional Court of Zimbabwe. Prior to pursuing his PhD studies at the Open University, he was a law lecturer at Jan-Dec Global University in India. Today, Lewis will be presenting his PhD project titled The Politics of Human Trafficking towards the Structural Analysis of Exploitation. Lewis, you have 30 to 35 minutes for your presentation, followed by 5 minutes for comments and questions, maximum from both the discussant and peer commentator. If time permits, we will then have a 10 to 15 minute question and answer session with attendees. The screen is now yours.
All right. Thank you for the great introduction. I'll try to stick to the time limits. So today I'll be presenting a section of my PhD studies that I've decided to write for publication. So the article is titled The Politics of Human Trafficking. So without further ado, this is the background of my studies. So the problem of human trafficking is one that is widespread and has become a global phenomenon that concerns virtually all the countries in the world. And at the center of the human trafficking problem is this idea of the accumulation of profit through the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. So research has shown that human trafficking, whether in people or in body parts, typically involves the exploitation of marginalized populations whose bodies are commoditized and used to generate profits by traffickers. So with all this in mind, the international community has developed anti-trafficking laws that are dedicated to addressing the human trafficking problem, with the main instrument being the Palermo Protocol of 2000 that we can see on the slide. So this protocol provides for state obligations to address human trafficking through what is known as the 3Ps policy. So that is prevention, protection, and prosecution. So these 3Ps policies form essentially the core of all anti-trafficking debates and policies worldwide. This takes us to the problem, right? So the political struggle with anti-trafficking language and discourse. So while it is clear that human trafficking is a problem that needs to be addressed, what constitutes trafficking-related exploitation is undefined. So as I mentioned, we have the Palermo Protocol, but the definition of human trafficking that we find in the protocol is open-ended and has allowed the anti-trafficking discourse to be a battleground for ideological supremacy. So through what we see now is through this grand narrative of physical suffering inherent in the term that is often used of modern slavery. This term is often used as an umbrella term to refer to various problematic forms of exploitation. And through this language of modern slavery, anti-trafficking debates have been characterized by processes of inclusion and exclusion. So anti-trafficking law has emerged as a site for political battles on who is to be included as a human trafficking victim and who is to be excluded as well. So this creates a hierarchy of so-called deserving victims, and those that do not meet the dominant idea are pushed to the periphery. So the focus on crime prevention comes with this image of a modern slave, and it naturally leads to the problematization of the most extreme cases of exploitation. And it largely ignores the social economic conditions that make people vulnerable to such exploitation in the first place. So my argument is that this depoliticizes the trafficking problem by rendering invisible the role that the state plays in creating conditions that make certain groups of people more vulnerable to exploitation. So in this way, crime and immigration control emerges as the way to address human trafficking, but it also silences alternative understanding of the problem and solutions to it. My critical framework uses, as the introduction said, I use a critical legal approach to conceptualizing exploitation. And this paper looks at it from an ideological critique perspective. So it's pretty much an analysis of domination. So the research unpacks anti-trafficking discourse and attempts to provide an alternative understanding of what trafficking-related exploitation is. So through ideology critique, the paper analyzes social, economic, and political struggles that are behind the dominant understanding of human trafficking. So therefore, the idea is to deconstruct the power dynamics behind supposed neutral pronouncement of the law, and to examine how these power dynamics shape and limit the opportunities available to affected persons. And also the idea is to explore who is harmed by these systemic power imbalances and how they are harmed by these structural injustices. So the basic idea is that law is politics, right? And as you can see from the quotation that we have from Kennedy, This means that this law, as law is politics, the definitions of what human trafficking is essentially an issue of political struggle. The law can be deconstructed and reconstructed to give expression to interests that are overlooked in our current understanding of problematic exploitation. What you see is there are two main ways of thinking about human trafficking. There's a transactional exploitation perspective, which is the dominant understanding of what exploitation is. And my paper advances a structural account of exploitation. So transactional exploitation looks at human trafficking as autonomous instances of oppression that require aggressive criminalization to be remedied. As we will see, this view of human trafficking as involving opportunistic accounts of exploitation represents the main approach that is grounded in the Palermo Protocol, the law that we have. So while this approach is useful in prosecuting offenders, it does little to address the underlying causes for the occurrence of human trafficking. But on the other hand, we have structural accounts that are more interested in how legal and economic structures play a role in creating a vulnerability that makes certain groups of people more vulnerable to exploitation. So here we're concerned with examining the root causes behind the human trafficking problem. And as we shall see later on, structural accounts of exploitation view human trafficking as a result of economic inequalities that are due to carefully coordinated policies of exclusion, dispossession, and structural violence. So these structural forms of domination and exclusion are often enforced by the law itself, and in turn, it makes the law a central part in the commodification and the exploitation of human bodies. So the transactional exploitation account or interpersonal exploitation account, this you see much of the literature on exploitation focuses on this aspect in human trafficking discourse. So it focuses on the micro level injustice. So as you can see from the diagram, these are actions between individuals as opposed to the macro level, right? Looking at the problem from a political, economic, and social analysis of how it stems from this macro, broader level. In other words, this interpersonal account is more concerned with, interrogating individual instances of exploitation. And as you can see from the point from Susan Marks, she says this is a result of practitioners acting within the boundaries of the legal system itself. This is because the structure and liberal construction of the law focuses on the micro and not on the macro. So attention is directed at the individual exploitative practices, but it ignores the vulnerabilities that expose people to such abuses. And this is often justified on the grounds of the practicality of remedies, right? And this ironically depoliticizes the practicality of the remedies themselves, as we will establish later on. So, but basically, these transactional accounts focus more on what exploitation is through just looking at these individual relations of domination, but it overlooks the broader social economic structures. So, as we establish, there is a structural limitation of the law itself. So one of these structural limitations of the law is that it uses this language of liability to assign responsibility for rights violations, right? And as you can see, Young refers to this liability model as looking at injustice basically from how it arises from interpersonal relationships between persons who act with an understanding of the consequences of their actions. So anti-trafficking law, you see, it adopts this liability model in understanding problematic forms of exploitation, and it focuses more on identifying interpersonal wrongs that can be connected or attributed to persons acting outside an accepted moral baseline. So as a result, anti-trafficking law falls into this trap of drawing rigid and binary lines between what constitutes free and what constitutes unfree labor practices. This unfortunately limits the law's ability to address abuses that are a result of cumulative systemic injustices, as these systemic injustices cannot be easily traced back to individual wrongdoing. And when we're talking about systemic injustice, we are referring to those unfair patterns of disadvantage and privilege that are grounded in the law that have a cause and effect relationship with human trafficking or with human rights abuses. And by nature, it is impossible to establish a direct causal relationship between individual harms, such as human trafficking, and this structural injustice that leads to, and it often leads to anti-trafficking ignoring this broader framework within which human trafficking occurs. I have picked just one example of how courts look at human trafficking, and this is from the European Court of Human Rights. It's a landmark case, Rantsev versus Cyprus. And if you look at it, you can see the court conceptualizes exploitation from a transactional account. And here it focuses more on the interpersonal relation of one person controlling another person. And you can see examining human trafficking from a transactional lens entails looking at this interaction between two people and asking whether the terms of the agreement between them is sufficiently fair, or asking if the circumstances under which the agreement was concluded is defective for some recognized reason, for instance, like lack of consent, use of violence, threats against victims, the usual stuff. But what you see is the causes of such exploitation is largely limited to this dynamic of individual bad apples that force and criminally exploit vulnerable individuals. So by not situating the exploitation of the victim within the wider socioeconomic context, it then paints the image of human trafficking as an autonomous or random instance of domination, rather than a normal functioning of a global political economy that relies on cheap, exploitable labor. So the idea behind this is that the conceptualization of problematic exploitation it's easier for us to blame it on individuals, right? Individual wickedness, than to interrogate like historical processes at the macro level that create vulnerability. So it's an easy way to just look at it, and it's harder to address these systemic inequalities. But the result of this assumption of the individual nature of human trafficking often leads to the centrality of transnational criminal law and a focus on, just addressing this as a criminal aspect, like a criminal control issue or an immigration control issue. And this overlooks the fact that human trafficking is fundamentally linked with labor exploitation for the accumulation of profit. So my argument is that there is a need to move from these individual accounts of causality to political economic accounts that unpack the global relations of domination that enable the commodification of human bodies. My argument is that there is a continuum of exploitation that we need to start looking at. So we can see that a transactional account of exploitation creates this binary conception of freedom starts here and it ends here, right? Through whether, objectively speaking, there is a lack of consent on the individual interaction. But the problem with this approach is that the question of consent is more complicated than a simplistic, rigid idea of freedom and free practices. So you can see the 2005 report from Greta, which is a group of experts against trafficking human beings, and it notes this idea of a fluidity of freedoms and unfreedoms that characterize in human trafficking cases. So these freedoms and unfreedoms cannot be properly accommodated in a simplistic assessment of immediate circumstances under which the agreement was made, because the real life experiences of trafficking victims are not fixed, but they instead exist on a continuum made up of varying degrees of seriousness, varying degrees of exploitation. So it is important for us to start thinking of human trafficking from a structural or broader lens. And also, what you can see from a transactional approach is this idea of depoliticization. As you can see from the quotation on the screen, they talk about slavery is a bad thing perpetrated by bad people, right? So the focus is more on individual relations of domination, and it paints this as nothing more than that. So this depoliticizes what is in fact a political issue and hides the role that the state plays in creating conditions that make people vulnerable to exploitation. Then this takes us to what I'm proposing, a structural account of exploitation. So Marxists have long argued that coercion and exploitation is structural. And this is because structural vulnerability was created historically through a process of violent dispossession, where people lose access to communal lands, use access to their property, also through imperial conquests, and in modern days, what we call neoliberalism, and fundamentally just a repression of labor rights. So the idea is that the violent expansion of capitalism throughout the globe has created structural conditions that place certain groups of people in this perpetual vulnerable position. And this group of people is forced by circumstances to work for the capitalist class. So labor is often used in this account of exploitation to, talk about labor as being essentially voluntary or coerced. And labor is coerced when a person is faced with two disagreeable options and they have to select the lesser of the two evils in order to survive. So this will turn into exploitation when the party occupying a stronger bargaining position uses that position or uses a specific vulnerability of a person to make them agree to lesser favorable terms that they would have otherwise agreed to if they were in a more secure position. And most cases of economic exploitation would satisfy this account of coercion, as victims often appear to have consented to their exploitation. And some have referred to this as the paradox of exploitation, is more often than not, you see people who seem to have agreed to work in these abusive or exploitative working arrangements. But what you see is that two factors that come out of this. The one factor is an aspect of vulnerability, and the other is an aspect of profit accumulation that you see in a structural account of exploitation. Then, if we are looking at structural injustices, we have to start at the link between the political economy, the global political economy, and human trafficking. So from a perpetrator's perspective, the accumulation of profit at the expense of vulnerable individuals is a central driving force behind their involvement in the trafficking of persons. And as we've mentioned, human trafficking entails the exploitation of vulnerable groups whose bodies are commoditized for profit. So the centrality of profit accumulation in human trafficking points to the role that the current global political economy plays as a structural environment within which the problem flourishes. So one might be tempted to argue that the accumulation of profit is as old as trade itself, and you cannot attribute it to capitalistic societies. But research from Madison, 2015, counters this point by noting that the generalized and continuous accumulation of profit is something that is unique and inherent in capitalistic societies. So the current political economy not only requires that those who have property, those who control production must seek profit, but that they must adapt their processes to ensure the maximization of that profit. So profit at all cost, even the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. So there is this idea of companies have to exploit or they have to fail. So the global political economy functions through this logic of exploit or fail, as you can see from the work that is cited in the slide. So this quotation that I have shows a crucial element of the structural injustice present, which seems to force all parties to play to the rules of the game in order to stay competitive. So corporations have no real choice but to attempt to extract as much profit from workers as possible. And if they don't do it, their business may be undercut by competitors with more flexible moral standards. So in such cases where corporations and individuals are constrained, you notice that the employment contract now emerges as an ideological tool that hides or conceals various modes of unfreedom. I will use an example of export processing zones that we have in the Global South to show how contracts and property law can be used to hide exploitation and coercion. So then from the standpoint of human trafficking victims, you will see that poverty is often mentioned as the main driving force in making them more vulnerable to exploitation. So what you notice is that in poverty decreases the chances of victims to remove themselves from exploitative situations, as doing so often entails risking their source of livelihood. So they have to, that's where the paradox of exploitation comes in. They have to agree to exploitation, otherwise they face the threat of starvation, hunger, and all different sorts of difficulties. So in other words, their only choice is to either remain in the exploitative or oppressive situation or face starvation as a free person. So the centrality of poverty in making people vulnerable to exploitation requires an examination of the framework within which such economic need is systemically produced. So various scholars have observed that capitalism produces extreme poverty in the same breath that it does profit for corporations. So these socioeconomic inequalities that give one group of people a greater bargaining power while making others vulnerable is seen to be an indictment of our current political economy. This economic infrastructure, the global political economy, is protected and reinforced by laws itself. The international law is a reflection of domestic law. So the relationship between exploitative relations in the political economy and the law is mutually reinforcing. So an argument is made under Marxist legal studies that legal relations that arise out of economic relations legal relations arise out of economic relations. So this means that the law acts as this broader superstructure, and it lacks its own identity and is bound to the economic structure of the society. So with this idea, you see that both international law and domestic law play a vital role in creating and sustaining inequalities in the political economy. So for instance, you can think of international monetary law, and in the Global South, there have been these programs that are known as structural adjustment programs. And these have been used to ensure capital mobility, freedom for capital to move beyond borders. But this has also reduced the labor protections that are available to people in the Global South through the deregulation of markets, flexibilization of labor markets, and all different mechanisms. So in this environment, background legal entitlements work to shape relations of power and domination. So for instance, you can look at the entitlement to property. Capital is property, and property has been recognized as a regime which can be used to extract concessions from those that need income for survival and for creation of a dependence on those who have access to that property. And in the context of increased vulnerability through poverty, property right owners can legitimately use their privileged position to persuade people to agree to exploitative relations. And here you see that contract law then, emerges in such circumstances to hide and mask these relations of exploitation, and this gives it legitimacy. In this way, victims of exploitation are blindsided by the structure of their exploitation, which is made to seem as representing ordinary rules of contracts, because you've signed the dotted line, you've agreed to be exploited, you haven't been forced, but we're not looking at the socio-economic circumstances that have persuaded you to agree to those terms. So as a result, contract law often acts as an ideological tool, through which domination and exploitation is naturalized. So let's look at a more modern case. So we have these export processing zones that I've talked about. So EPZs are order-driven manufacturing sectors that are notoriously known for exploitative working conditions, such as long working hours, poor remuneration, non-existent health and safety standards in the Global South. And these zones are a normal functioning of the capital logic of expansion. So it is within the interest of profit accumulation to reduce remuneration and to increase working hours. So you can think an example of sweatshop laborers. In sweatshops, the employment contract is used to give an illusion of freedom. So people have agreed to work in a sweatshop, so it gives an illusion that they are free, but essentially they are forced by their circumstances. So exploitation in EPZs is legitimized by the flexibilization of labor law and the apparent consent of the worker. So it is difficult to draw a clear demarcation between free and unfreedom, as the two are part of the same continuum of structural exploitation. And this is made worse by the fact that the formal equality that we have in the law is met with material inequality that is present in real life situations. So often one party negotiates the contract of employment from a position of privilege because they have property, and the other negotiates from a position of vulnerability, as we can see from these EPZs. So the line between freedom and unfreedom cannot be easily drawn in such circumstances. And you can see a quotation that I've put from Banerjee, which pretty much says that it is an open question whether the contract would have been made had each party had other physically imaginable options that are not available to them. So the question of duress always arises in those circumstances. I think that's where I'll conclude. I'll be happy to hear your feedback on the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Thank you, Lewis, for this wonderful presentation on the topic of human trafficking. I really enjoyed the interdisciplinarity, the combination of law, politics, economy, and the international relations. That was very commendable. Let me go straight to Dr. Rumi for her comments.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so first of all, the paper was very thought-provoking, and I appreciated Lewis's careful analysis of human trafficking and exploitation from the lens of historical and the structural injustices, and his focus on economic foundation of the relational dynamics between the perpetrator, defined at large, and the victim. So I really wanted to congratulate you for your keen analytical focus on political economy of human trafficking. So I have many points that I've written down, but I thought it may make more sense, at least to me, that I can describe where I came from and how there are similarity in the differences that I saw in Lewis's paper. So my own interdisciplinary group of researchers collectively having experience in the criminal justice system, sociology, social work, psychiatry, and public health. And I cover sociology, psychiatry, and public health in my group. So we have come to a conclusion, actually, over time. It took us for a long time that the current legal definitions are insufficient, to say minimum, to grasp the spectrum of exploitation and trafficking for several reasons. So I'm just going to list a few, and some of which are quite methodological. It's not the legal framework, but you can understand why I feel so excited about your work. So Palermo Protocol, as well as the U.S. Trafficking Victim Protection Act, what we call TIPVA, there are legal definitions, and they are based on prosecutorial approach. So making the vast strata of exploitation to human trafficking spectrum outside of a legal scope. So in the public health approach, we call that the tip of the iceberg problem. And very different look from your lens, but we're talking about the same thing. So I totally agree with his assertion that the binary and the rigid separation between the free and unfree labor is incapable of effectively conceptualize the spectrum of exploitation. The second, because the laws are legal framework document, they do not provide exact operational definitions that can be translated to rigorous empirical research. And this is the angle that I take as empirical researcher. Who wanted to advocate evidence-based findings. So, so Luis mentioned the Palermo Protocol's 3P. In the US, we use 4P, adding partnership to prevention, protection, and the prosecution. And so based upon this 4P approach, US funding agencies typically prioritize prosecution area. So the rigorous empirical approach and the work in the prevention and protections are still in their infancy. They're just all over the map, in my opinion. So from our point of view, we want to come up with empirical research that demonstrate what works, and that the notion of what works for prevention and protection is equivalent to randomized control studies in the medicine and the public health. So it's a very different approach, but we wanted to use the law, we wanted to use the approaches to come up with empirically sound research. And the fourth, to demonstrate the efficacy of prevention and protection study, researchers and the legal practitioners as well must have measures of underlying structural factors. So that no longer is called the risk and the predictive factors, but that they have to be conceptualized at the micro individual and the inter-individual level to more micro neighborhood, community, in the society at large. Those are the multi-layer levels of understanding of structural factors. You call it structural injustice. It's almost the same thing. And this is where I think Lewis and our group's fundamental conceptualization kind of merged together. There are elements that I don't quite agree with you, and one has to do with the pursuit of accumulation of capital, and this, in my opinion, is a rationalist interpretation. But having worked in the psychiatry, there's a lot of irrational psychological aspect in the human trafficking, especially in sex trafficking among individuals. So that's one area that I wasn't quite clear how you wanted to kind of modify that. The second one is the use of global political economy or capitalism. So that's what still to me is not precisely defined. For example, in a communist bloc, Xinjiang autonomous regions, there are state sanctions, labor force violations, and it's not done just for the purpose of accumulating the wealth. It is not strictly a capitalist, although they are capitalist society. So there's terminology I think would need to be modified or clarified in some ways. Okay, and okay, let me just skim through. So overall, I agree with a lot of assertions you make. I think it's a very fresh air type of analysis, but there should be somewhere to include irrational aspect of a capitalist society or the profit making. And also, I wasn't that comfortable to denounce anti-trafficking laws such as Panama Protocol as purely co-opted and exploited by the capitalist society. After all, it was devised to improve anti-trafficking movement. So there has to be some protection of the legal development, which is nonetheless progressive, even though it was co-opted by this, social factors. Okay, so I will end there, and I hope I met the time limit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Without much ado, I will go to Dr. Klea Ramaj. Please, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation, Luis, and for the paper. So I read your paper and I enjoyed it. So the paper offered a critical examination of legal and political framework surrounding human trafficking as we know it now. So, and its core, the article tried to challenge the narrative that treats trafficking as a discrete criminal act and focused instead on the structural understanding behind the factors that leads to this injustice and also tied to global capitalism. So first I'm going to list the strengths of the articles, or what I believe to be the strengths of the article, and then I'll move on to what I believe are some limitations and some questions that I have. So with regards to strengths, I really appreciated the theoretical depth and originality of the article. So your paper is grounded in Marxist theory, ideology critique, critical legal studies, and offered a structural lens to understanding human trafficking, which is rather innovative in itself. This interdisciplinary approach by combining the legal theory, political economy, and ideology critique. And you suggested that rather than we focusing on a transactional approach and transactional exploitation, which deems the light at individual acts of courts as abuse, we should rather focus on the systems and the structures that lead to the facilitation of exploitation in the first place. And that is a very valid point. So what makes people vulnerable to fall prey to this trafficking system? The second issue, which I believe is a strength and which has resonated with my work as well, is your critique on the anti-trafficking legal structure, and specifically in international law and Palermo Protocol per se. In the paper, you argued that the Palermo Protocol prioritizes border control and crime prevention over victim protection, and that it uses a vague language, and I agree with that. For example, I can give an example from my own research. In my own research, I researched the return and reintegration of victims of human trafficking. So after they had been trafficked abroad, mainly in Western European countries, when they returned to their home countries and the challenges that they faced. Most of them didn't want to be returned to their home countries because they would face the same problems that render them a prey to trafficking in the first place. However, Article 8.2 of the Palermo Protocol explicitly states that the return should be preferably voluntarily, and this preferably voluntary clause in the Palermo Protocol is quite problematic, given that the obligation of the destination country is quite unclear. It is plausible to argue that this clause is meaningless because taking into consideration the voluntariness of trafficking victims is not mandatory. Many destination countries actually choose to forcibly return victims more often than not, even though this might be problematic for the victims and might put them into danger. So this vague language, I just gave one example, but this vague language is indeed quite prevalent in the Palermo Protocol. So your point there was very valid. So the paper itself challenges the reader to rethink not only to challenge how we define and address human trafficking, but also to challenge the broader role of law in sustaining this system of domination and oppression. Another strength of the article was the focus on the historical account, on how colonialism, capitalism, and neoliberalism have created those historical and socioeconomic conditions that make people vulnerable to trafficking and that normalize a phenomenon such as human trafficking in the first place. So basically, again, arguing that human trafficking is not just a criminal act, but a symptom of a systemic inequality. So these were the strengths, and I also had some limitations and some questions I wanted to ask. So the first limitation that I thought the paper could have benefited of more empirical data and case studies. I know you mentioned one case study in the paper, in the presentation as well, from the European Court of Human Rights, but I would appreciate it if you could have drawn more empirical, concrete studies out there on how specifically structural injustices manifest in the cases of human trafficking, for example, in cases of domestic work, forced labor, or sexual exploitation. So, for example, how patriarchal systems facilitate the objectification of women to be used as sexual objects. That's just one idea. The second one, the second limitation that I thought was worth noting is a link to the facts of policy recommendations. So the article critiques the existing frameworks. However, it does not offer concrete alternatives. So what would, for example, a structurally informed anti-trafficking policy look like, according to you? What would be a better system? So how can international law be reinformed to address this structural injustice that you rightfully mentioned in the article? Also, similar to Dr. Rumi, Kato, Price, I also believe that there was a lack of a balanced engagement with the with a critique with regards to Palermo Protocol. So the tone was quite heavily critical, and there was this lack of balance with regards to some of the positive aspects of the Palermo Protocol and how we can instead focus on broadening the article, the Palermo article. Palermo Protocol, interpretation rather than just critiquing. So how can we broaden our interpretation of the protocol as it is now? I also wanted to focus on the issue of bad actors. So you mentioned that human trafficking is not just a matter of bad actors, but is a structural and systemic problem, which is true. However, those bad actors still have individual responsibility and have a free will of whether they engage in the criminal act of human trafficking or not. And I'm referring here to the traffickers. So they still need to be held accountable for their criminal acts, even though they are acting within a structure that facilitates this crime in the first place. There is still free will and personal responsibility when one chooses to engage in a crime. So yeah, these were my comments. Thank you very much.
Let me jump to Giulia. Giulia, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this very rich and thought-provoking manuscript, Lewis. I truly appreciated the depth and ambition of your intervention and the arguments that you advance, so that of pushing us to move beyond individualized transactional understandings of exploitation and towards systemic and structural analysis, I think is not only timely but necessary. It resonates a lot with my own work in the field and opens space to reimagine the foundations of anti-trafficking law and practice, I think, and to think more honestly about the conditions that render people vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. I think that your engagement with Marxist and critical legal theory is rigorous and compelling. And by showing how legal categories such as property and contract operate as background structures that naturalize and legitimize inequality, I think you convincingly reveal how the law itself participates in sustaining the very arms it claims to redress in some cases. What is particularly powerful in your work, I think, is how you center structural injustice not as an abstraction, but as a lead condition with deep historical roots, so shaped by capitalism, imperialism, and neoliberal legal political orders. And these framings, I think it helps us, together with the lived experience, not just in asking what is exploitation, but also how and why it persists, and whose interests are served by the dominant legal and policy responses. And I also found your critique of the modern slavery discourse especially incisive, particularly how it has been deployed to reinforce securitized migration controls. And this reminded me, of course, of Giulia O'Connell's Davidson works, which show how anti-trafficking narratives often erase migrant agency while legitimizing restrictive border regimes. And your intervention adds meaningfully to this conversation by insisting on a fuller picture on the global political economy in which trafficking occurs. So I will join Klea with a couple of comments that your work made me think about. I think that the first is that your structural critique could be deepened through more explicit engagement with intersectional frameworks, mainly to avoid the flattening of the experience of the victims to mere questions of economic needs. So vulnerability to trafficking is never singular or neutral. It is profoundly shaped by the interactions of race, gender, class, migration status, and more. And we see this reflected in the persistent use of the reductive binaries like the ideal victim versus its evil perpetrator. And scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw and Angela Harris have shown how legal definitions can obscure these layered forms of marginalization. And similarly, Evelyn Nakano-Glenn's work on unequal freedoms offers tools to analyze how state power constructs racialized and gendered labor hierarchies. So an intersectional lens could further strengthen your critique by highlighting how inequality is not just pervasive, but differentially patterned, and a point you touched upon while discussing, for example, global apartheid or global economic apartheid. Second and lastly, I think that your theoretical argument is very rich, and I think grounding it in further empirical texture, so through expanded concrete examples from case law or more, say, ethnographic evidence, could add further depth. I think about the works of Letizia Palumbo on domestic and care workers, for example, that show how the freely chosen contracts often conceal deep structural coercion. And likewise, Hannah Lewis and Roberts and colleagues published in 2019, I think, document how precarious agricultural labor in the UK operates under conditions of legal and economic ambiguity. So these are examples that might help connect your theoretical insight to the policy and institutional context in which exploitation is made to appear legitimate. And to carry the conversation forward, I just have two questions, very quick. I know we don't have a lot of time. The one is it has already been mentioned, but I was wondering what are your practical recommendations for the evolution, even like at a transitional level of how we can improve the legal system. And the second one would be if you have a working definition of exploitation that move beyond these binaries and that embeds the structural critiques in its very definition.
Thank you very much, Giulia, for wonderful comments and all of you for useful feedback. Lewis, since we are over time, so let me check with the attendees if they have any question. I was noticing you were taking notes, so already you have got a lot of notes. So let me check with the attendees if they have any questions or comments they want to make. All right, in that case, I invite you to respond to these comments. You don't need to respond to all of those comments because one thing I'm, in academia, that the feedback, the review, the critique, it's a continuous process. So just prioritize the comments briefly if you want to give a collective response. Entirely up to you. Please, over to you.
Thank you all. Thank you to the panel and everyone who attended. And these are all great comments and feedback. As I'm preparing for my Viva, I'm sure this will be very useful as well as I defend my thesis. So just to touch on the aspect of empirical data, I do realize and admit that that is a major limitation because my PhD was mostly theoretical, so I didn't do case studies. But the idea was to try and build a theoretical framework and for future research now. So after I finish, the future research that I want to do is now more empirical to test these ideas and also to see the intersectionality of how structural injustices affect people with different identities. So I do take on board a lot of the recommendations on intersectionality. And for policy recommendations, I struggled with that because my thesis does have some policy recommendations that I did, but I struggled to fit it within, the word count of the paper. But I realize now that, I probably have to do that. But some of the things that I recommended, I looked at the theory of justice. I looked at work of Iris Marion Young, John Rawls, and this theory of justice that, unjust structures need to be abolished. So it sounds very simplistic, but the idea that if there are any structures that are making people more vulnerable to exploitation, could be restrictive immigration regimes, they need to be addressed to address that vulnerability. But as I've mentioned, poverty is a main thing that makes people more vulnerable. So it's a significant contributor. It's not the only thing. And I know we are short of time, but I was just gonna say, I've proposed things like, progressive taxation to assist people who are in dire need. I've also looked at, income redistribution, but it depends also whether through taxation or maybe sometimes through giving people capacity to resist exploitative arrangements. But yeah, overall, thank you so much for the comments. I do take them on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Thank you, Lewis, for an insightful presentation of your project, for sharing this project, which seems to be a great contribution to the wider literature on human trafficking. Many thanks to Dr. Klea, Dr. Rumi, Giulia, and to everyone who attended the session. The Global South Network warmly welcomes PhD students from any discipline and any part of the world to share their projects and receive interdisciplinary feedback. Anyone interested in presenting their work or participating in a session can contact me at leicleakgsn@gmail.com. Same time next week, let's meet our next guest speaker, Sara Kayuchi, PhD candidate, School of Law, University of Nottingham, who will present their PhD project titled Exploring Pathways to Justice to Address the Nexus Between Conflict-Related Sexual Violence and Terrorism in Uganda on 11th of June 2025 from 3 to 4 p.m. UK time. Take care, look after yourself, and have a wonderful day.
So,
Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.